That again, post-lockdown, and particularly with the fact that lockdown has enabled us to see what it can be like if we reduce pollution, we leave the animals alone for a while. You may have seen on Apple TV the year the world changed with David Attenborough, where he looks around the world at the way in which the animal kingdom has bounced back in the year in which we left them alone. So there's a big focus that's growing with on sustainability, and particularly amongst the young, as they look around and see things like the fires that are taking place around Europe and North America at the moment. So expect that to continue to be a big focus going forward. Another unfortunate trend that continues, that was underway previously, and unfortunately with COVID has really been given quite great acceleration, is the increase in inequality. So if you look, for example, back in 2013, there was a study done by Bloomberg which showed that in the 1950s, the average difference between the CEOs of the largest corporates in America and the average worker was about 20 times the salary. So the CEOs were earning about 20 times what the workers were earning. In 2013, they showed that they were earning around 209 times more than the average worker. And this was already 8 years ago. Today, we're seeing that increase even further. So expect over the next couple of years quite a lot of focus on the increase in inequality around the world. Excuse me. There's also increased competition for places, schools, universities, jobs, etc. This was, again, a trend that was underway, but will continue to be so. People have realized that as the number of jobs reduce and the number of people increase, the number of places become far hotter to try and get a hold of. And so the competition for places in schools, universities, and jobs is going to continue to increase over the next 5-10 years, without a doubt. And one of the outcomes of that is a growth in the anxiety and the seriousness of our youth. So already over the last number of years, if you look at this graph here, you'll see from The Economist, which is quoting the World Health Organization's behavioral study that they do every few years. And they ask a series of questions of 15-year-olds in the OECD countries, the wealthier countries of the world. And you'll see that between 1997 and 2014, there was a significant increase in the well-behaved nature of the youth. So if you look at those that responded to saying that they'd been drunk at least twice, these are 15-year-olds, you can see a dramatic decrease from 1997 to 2014. Those that reported having had sex at the age of 15 also decreased. And a big reason for this is that they're finding it easier to talk to their fathers. So they can have a relationship with their parents and they can have an open conversation about these things rather than going away and doing them without thinking about the consequences. So their behavior has become much more conservative. And with COVID, it's going to become even more conservative. So, you expect to see a decrease in things like alcohol consumption, in things like the use of tobacco, in things like driving drunk, etc., because people are a lot more worried. They don't want their pictures up on social media because everything's online now. They can have stories spread about themselves all over the place. And of course, they're spending a lot more time with their families because they're in closer proximity much more of the time. It does also mean, though, that it's difficult for them to have face-to-face relationships with their friends and physical relationships with their peers. So again, lonelier, more anxious, more serious going forward. If we look at the direct impact of COVID-19, so those were some of the trends that were underway already and some of the things that we can expect to continue to accelerate because of what's happened with COVID-19. There are some things where there've been a direct impact of COVID-19 in the short term. And essentially, the outcome of COVID-19 and the lockdowns is that we've been forced to rethink everything that we do. And so everything that we do, everything we think about is being impacted by that short-term result. And I want to start by looking at some of the winners and losers of COVID-19. And I'll divide it into four major sectors. The first one being what I call flash in the pan. So we saw over the last year a dramatic increase in the number of companies providing personal protective equipment, hand sanitizers, bootleg tobacco and alcohol. But these are not things that are necessarily going to last in the long term. So companies that dived into providing masks and so on, because the barriers to entry were quite low and there was an incredible demand for it, will not necessarily see it out for the long term. So that's why I call it flash in the pan. Some people benefited very quickly, but they're not likely to benefit over the longer term. There are others that had quite a serious knock to their world, but are going to experience a long but slow recovery. And aviation is a good example of this. The airlines around the world, there are airlines that have done particularly badly and have gone under. And then there are other airlines that are starting to bounce back quite effectively, usually in the budget space. Another one similarly related to that is hotels and restaurants. So fewer people going away on holiday, fewer people going particularly on business travel, which has a big impact on the hotel and restaurant industry. Also conferences and exhibitions, in-person conferences. I used to be on the board of the Cape Town International Convention Center, which could take conventions of 10 to 20,000 people at a time. The likelihood that that's likely to come back again anytime soon is low. So conferences and exhibitions, another industry that will eventually come back, but it's going to take a few years. Film and entertainment has also taken a big knock, not only because of the cinemas being closed or cinemas being severely reduced in terms of their capacity, but also because of moving crews around the world to go and film in interesting and different locations, being able to have actors and crew in the same space, etc. Gyms, another one that is likely to take quite a while to come back. And related to that, because of the same trend, is team sports. So people are staying away from being in close proximity to each other. So they're staying out of gyms, and they're also staying away from contact sports. What has taken its place is that people have moved into cycling, running, hiking, surfing, all individual sports. And as a result, those team sports and those gyms will suffer, and they will take a fair period of time to bounce back to where we expect them to be or where we are used to having had them. And then there's some things that I think are likely to fade away over time. One being giant retail malls. I think people have got used to the idea of shopping online, the idea of having things delivered, and the idea of going to a massive mall and hanging out with hundreds of other people becomes a lot less appealing. So that shift, I think, is something that we will see change the way that retail is offered over time. Another one is high-rise offices. There's no doubt that there is a lower requirement for head offices and for the number of people to be crammed into a space at one time. And as a result, the high-rise offices that have been built in places like Sandton are likely to suffer. And those companies that own those properties will be looking for other uses for that space. Convenience retail, that's the kind of retail that you would do if you were on your way to work or on your way back from work or school and stop and buy a packet of chips and a Coke at a garage, is also something that is likely to see less activity as fewer people travel to work. If you're not actually driving to work 5 days a week and instead you're only doing it 2 days a week and you aggregate that across an entire population, your demand for convenience retail decreases quite dramatically. And that's likely to stick with us going forward. And then mass public transit. On a global scale, people are unlikely to be that keen to cram in to the London Underground where there are hundreds and hundreds of people in any given carriage. That's also likely to be something that people will be trying to stay away from going forward. In terms of taking over and the industries of the future, certainly online shopping and home delivery is something that has taken off enormously. It's created a trend that is likely to stick with us for a long time going forward. At the same time, we're seeing a growth in artisanal niches. So, for example, you can see a significant growth in the number of bakeries, the number of butcheries, the number of local barbers that are sort of sprouting up all over the place. And if you look at the retail malls that are using less and less space, more and more of them are encouraging those artisanal companies that are baking bread or making croissants or whatever it happens to be, to take smaller pieces of their property and encourage the growth of those. So it's almost a swing back to what life used to be like back when I was a kid in the 70s, when we used to go to the butcher to get our meat rather than to go to a large retailer. So we'll see those existing more and more in partnership and alongside the bigger retailers as well. Online education, another area that is likely to stick with us for a long time to come. People have got used to working online. The kids in high school at the moment are used to working online. The university students are all mostly working online. And it's something that will become something that is just a part of what they do. So online education is definitely an area that is likely to grow and take over. Not necessarily kill off, but certainly become much more prominent than it's ever been before in relation to physical education. Remote working, if you look at the companies that benefit from remote working, give one example, Logitech, the maker of keyboards, mice, screens, cameras, all of that sort of thing. Those companies are absolutely booming and are likely to continue to benefit from the remote working around the world. And then I mentioned earlier, cycling, running, hiking, surfing. There's a range of individual sports that are absolutely booming. Try to order a new mountain bike today, you're going to have a good long wait ahead of you. So looking at the way that companies can take advantage of that and are taking advantage of it, one of the things that's happening at the moment is that those businesses that have strong balance sheets, they're not heavily indebted, they've got cash that they can spend. Those are the ones that are taking over at the moment. So what you're seeing in businesses that have been heavily impacted by COVID and by the changes that have taken place is that the strong businesses are triumphing and they are buying up the medium-sized and the smaller businesses to a large degree. At the same time, what we have is a divergence, because you are also seeing the startups of those small businesses, those artisanal niches, for example, that I spoke about. So you're seeing a spread towards larger, stronger companies becoming even larger, and then smaller companies becoming more prevalent. Then there's also a move away from premium towards value. As shoppers have less money to spend. So, for example, if you look at Foschini Group, which bought Jet from Edcon when it went under, a large part of their growth over the last year has been the fact that they bought Jet and the fact that more and more customers are moving towards discount retail rather than Foschini's traditional upmarket target. So that move from premium towards value is definitely something that has been kicked off by COVID and will continue with us for some time to come. And then that divergence again that I spoke about, the disappearing middle, companies that are getting bigger, the strong companies getting bigger, and then people starting smaller businesses. And a lot of those smaller businesses are being started by people that are being laid off from their companies. And unfortunately, that laying off generally tends to happen in the middle again, within the organization. So instead of having supervisors looking after large groups of people, you take that supervisory layer out and you make the executives responsible directly for even larger groups of people. So that supervisory middle management layer is definitely the layer that is being most affected by the changes that are taking place. And then one of the things that businesses are increasingly doing, and we can see it over the last few months, where all sorts of businesses are announcing interesting link-ups and diversification to reduce the risk of future shock. So, for example, one in our local environment is Mr. Price buying Yuppiechef, which is an interesting opposite trend to what I just mentioned, which is the move from premium towards discount and value. Whereas Mr. Price has always been a discount and value retailer, they can't really go any further down in the value market. And so as a result, they've actually gone up into the Yuppie Chef business, and they've bought Yuppie Chef. So again, an example of diversifying in order to try to balance out your business a little bit more. And then one that I find particularly interesting, which is PepsiCo linking up with Boston Beer to create an alcoholic beverage called Hard Mountain Dew. Now, anyone who knows or remembers Mountain Dew, it is a sickly sweet, awful yellow drink that now will have alcohol in it, just to make it even more poisonous. So diversification, a definite trend that's likely to continue. And within the office environment, a reduction in head offices, definitely something that is happening at the moment and will continue to happen. The picture on the bottom left there is Discovery's head office in Sandton, built and completed literally months before COVID started, and now something of a ghost town because most of the people that were based in that office are working from home. So the need for big head offices is definitely reducing and will continue to reduce going forward. There will be less business travel when we use this medium more and more. We don't need to travel for business, so we don't have to get on a plane, have that unpleasant experience of having to wear a mask for several hours, and then go and meet people face to face. We can do what we do remotely, and we've learned that and we've got used to it, and it's going to become the way going forward. And then finally is this trend that I call home as castle. As people are working more and more from home, they become much more attached to their home. Whereas previously their home was somewhere where they went to sleep and eat. Today it's become where they do everything. They work, they eat, they sleep, they enjoy themselves, they have their indoor trainer, so it becomes their gym, their pub, their workplace, their home, etc. So the focus on home has become bigger and bigger. I, for example, over the last 8 months, have probably spent more on home renovation than I've spent in my entire life because I'm working from home and I'm spotting things that I want to have changed. And so I get somebody in to come and change it. So I'm building my little home as castle around me. And I think that across the world, people are doing the same thing. The impact on careers is a couple of interesting things that are taking place. The first one is that at the moment, certainly people are hanging on to their jobs. People are worried that if they leave their jobs, they are going to struggle to get into something else. So they're hanging on to their jobs in many cases, but at the same time, others are also reevaluating their lives. So our business, for example, we are in the business of placing executives as one of the things that we do. We go out and we look for CEOs, CFOs, etc., to place into businesses. And many of the assignments that we've had over the past year have been to replace people who have sat back and said, is this really what I want to do with the rest of my life? And have actually decided to opt out and go and do something entirely different. So some people are hanging on to their jobs. Other people are saying, this isn't really actually what fulfills me, and I'm going to do something different, and creates a vacancy in that way. At the same time, though, as businesses are focused on trying to manage their cash and protect their bank balances, they are extending hiring freezes in many cases. So that, again, ties into why people are hanging on to their jobs, because when their own business is doing hiring freezes, they're making the assumption that other businesses are doing the same. So they're not willing to step out and move into looking for something else. Organizations are being flattened. I talked about the disappearing middle, and that's very much what's happening across the board with larger organizations. As the middle layer of management is taken out, businesses are becoming flatter and flatter in terms of their structure. There is an increased use of technology to reduce human dependency. So if you look in industries like mining, there is no doubt that over the next 10 to 15 years in South Africa, we will follow the example of Australia and various other mining nations that have replaced people with technology. It's safer, it's more reliable, it's just easier to make sure that if there's a rock fall, you don't get shut down because people have lost their lives, for example. And the same thing is happening across manufacturing, across banking, across education, the use of AI and various other types of technology are replacing many of the people in organizations. So the large organizations are going to become less reliant on people, more reliant on technology, and the people are going to be needing to look for something else to do. The other thing about working remotely is that it has also changed, or it has shown the contrasting styles between people and how they work. Some people work well remotely, some people really don't. They really struggle with it. And much of that has to do not only with personality, but also with access to technology. So if you look, for example, at a company like Amazon, which has a very large business, a very large staff complement in Cape Town, even though they don't operate in South Africa, they have about 2,000 staff in Cape Town. They are busy building a brand new office to house many thousands of people. The major reason for that is because they know that many of those people come from areas that don't have the kind of technology that they require in order to give the service that they need to give to their customers around the world. And then I think what this has done, all of this highlights the need, and I'll come back to it in a second, the shift from management to leadership. You're not really managing people anymore. You're having to lead a fairly amorphous, changing, agile group of people rather than managing employees. And that's a real mind shift that is taking place and will continue to take place. So what are the required skills and capabilities that we as individuals need to be working on and building for ourselves? A couple of things. I think if you're younger, and for me it's far too late to be building on this sort of stuff, but certainly the younger people who are looking at setting out on their careers need to develop the principles of science and maths. That what essentially it does is that it enables them to develop their critical thinking and their problem solving. The need for agility is just so much greater than it's ever been before. The need to assess things, make decisions, come up with solutions is something that we've never had to deal with to this degree before. And as a result, that skill is something that we should definitely be encouraging young people to continue to focus on. Similarly, the mastery of technology is something that anyone in an office-based job, certainly, or traditionally office-based job, needs to do. And even outside of just your office-based jobs, the understanding of how to use technology is key. Over the last couple of months, we've had several parent-teacher meetings with our children's teachers, and it always interests me how after 18 months of online teaching, they still struggle with the technology. Trying to get the camera to work, trying to get the sound to work, etc. So it does make you worry a little bit what actually goes on in the class if they're struggling as much as they are. Experience in digital strategy also becomes key, very much in demand as the world changes and moves towards greater reliance on technology and digital business. So anyone who has that experience definitely is in demand. And if you don't yet have it, find a way to get it, because it's undoubtedly going to be a key capability going forward. Human connection is also a skill that is going to become difficult to develop as people are more and more remote. But the more that you can create human connection and create empathy through remote ways, the more valuable you become to an organization. The ability to draw on global best practice is also key. Being able to look at what goes on around the world, being able to see what solutions are being developed around the world and draw on that for the local environment is very valuable. And then personal time management and prioritization, also within a remote world. If you can't manage your own time and set your own priorities, you're going to struggle. So that time management and prioritization also becomes key. And then finally, self-reliance and teamwork, because you will spend a lot of your time working behind your desk away from the rest of your team. So you need to become self-reliant, but at the same time, you also need to be able to manage the teamwork aspect of it. So being able to step back into that team without having the discipline of being in an office where it's easy to do that. So self-reliance and teamwork, another key skill. So I talked about agility as one of the capabilities that is required. On top of those, we've got innovation, The more innovative people can be, the more they can come up with solutions, the more valuable they become to organizations. Empathy, the ability to understand what somebody's going through, even when you are unable to see them and you don't even sit in the same city as them, never mind in the same office. So empathy, a key capability. The ability to build trust, especially the ability to build trust with people who don't see you on a daily basis, a core capability. Collaboration, the ability to collaborate with people across the world, across the country, from different cultures, different languages, etc., and influence them in that collaboration process. Another capability. And finally, compassion, the ability to understand what people are going through as they are affected by things like COVID and whatever else might come down the track, and be able to show compassion for what they are going through. So I come back to what I said a moment ago, where I talked about moving from management to leadership. And these capabilities are all core capabilities to enable you to make that shift from just managing bodies to actually leading groups of people and making yourself indispensable as a leader of any organization going forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions. If anybody wants to email me, they can email me at that email address below. But I'm going to open it up to questions, and I believe that post 9:45 we'll be able to keep those questions going for anyone that's open to doing so.
Hi, Guy. It's Jody here from the Perco SA team. I'll put the questions to you so that you don't have to trawl through the chat. The first question I've got here is, with regard to home working, online fatigue has set in. Do you foresee that companies will consider a travel perk to attract and retain high-performing employees?
So in terms of a travel perk, if you mean going away on holiday, I would imagine probably not. But what is happening in places like the UK, for example, is that in fact the government is encouraging businesses to do exactly that. So encourage people to come into the office. The City of London's particular reason for doing that is because they don't want the City of London to die, because it is 100% dependent on offices. But definitely there is going to be a desire to get back into the office, but probably not on an ongoing basis. So it's a good question. I think if you look at a company like Amazon in the US, for example, they have actually said that people can continue to work from home indefinitely, but they will pay them less if they do that, because then they don't have to pay to come into the office. They don't have to pay for the commute, which is essentially exactly the same thing, just in reverse. Instead of actually paying people to come to the office, you are paying them less if they don't come to the office. So it's happening.
Hear you, yeah. Okay, here's one from a name that we recognize, Rob, who's also a speaker for Perco. Hi, Guy. Thanks for your interesting presentation. Work is going to change in the coming years. Digital transformation will start to have an impact in South Africa as well. Can you give any advice to the attendees on how best to respond to this?
So, I mean, I think that one of the things that we need to get right in South Africa is the ability for people to work remotely across the board. And I think that it's a challenge that we face. There are many communities that don't have the ability to work remotely to the same degree as more wealthy communities. So if businesses and government can certainly do quite a lot to enable remote working to be done more effectively. And that, for example, would be building into salary packages, paying for bandwidth, paying for the technology that is required to work from home. There's still many businesses in South Africa that don't pay for individuals to have bandwidth at home. They expect them to work from home, but they're not willing to pay for the home Wi-Fi. And then I think that that's something that's likely to change, and it's something that should change. And similarly, what government could do is to incentivize the rollout of the kind of infrastructure that is required in order to enable communities in poorer areas to get better access in order to enable them to work remotely. whether that means working in neighborhood areas where people go and they work in a shared space, or working actually from home. There are various ways in which the governments can incentivize the rollout of the kind of infrastructure that's required to make that happen.
Okay, I've got another one here. Which job opportunities do you foresee becoming more prevalent in future as artificial intelligence seems to be threatening the job market at the moment?
Yeah, so artificial intelligence will certainly impact many of the traditional roles that we've had. So particularly ones that are quite repetitive. So for example, if you look at law, where there's your young lawyers generally tend to spend a lot of time looking through case history, etc. Artificial intelligence can do that a lot more quickly and take on a lot more volume. So there are definitely some of those in banking, in law, in auditing, etc. Some of those careers that are likely to be negatively affected by artificial intelligence. I think that what's likely to benefit going forward is the human connection, and that's artificial intelligence can help us to do repetitive tasks well, but they can't help us to connect with other people on an empathetic, compassionate basis. And so those careers that involve working with people, and that, for example, includes teaching and nursing, university lecturers, etc., they're not likely to be replaced by AI, because people want to connect, they want to be able to ask questions, they want to be able to speak with an actual individual, an actual person, and learn from a person rather than just learning through impersonal means. So I hope that answers the question. I think a lot of the people-centered stuff is really what's likely to benefit.
Yeah, I've got a question that's come through by email here, but I think you've actually answered it. If you want to add anything, you can. But it's basically, what is government's role in helping to bridge the digital divide? I think you've covered quite a lot of that. So shall I just move on to the next one?
Sure.
Okay. How will employment contracts likely change with the increase in remote working?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I think the parts that make up a salary package, for example, are likely to change. I remember when I first started working, one of the great perks was that the company I was working for paid my gym membership. I think what would definitely not have been considered at that point would be the company paying for my work from home technology. And I think that employment contracts are likely to start including those elements quite actively. And then also one of the things that's interesting is if you still look at employment contracts today, you'll see that they are location bound. So my employment contract, for example, states that I work in Johannesburg, even though I now live in Cape Town. And so we are looking at how do we change that? What do we need to do in order to enable somebody who lives in Plettenberg Bay to work from Plettenberg Bay in their employment contract, rather than holding it over them that they actually work in Johannesburg, and if they're required, then they themselves must get themselves to Johannesburg. So the contracts will become a lot more flexible around where people are based, how they work, rather than saying your office hours are from 8 till 5 and you have a 1 hour lunch break, which I still see in contracts all the time. That sort of language is going to change. There's no doubt about it. Become a lot more flexible and agile.
Thanks. Yeah. I've got another question here about how employers sort of allow for employees to be digitally active and connected, but you've also covered that. So I'm going to move on to this question here. How does a 45-plus-year-old reskill for the next 20 years in a career? I'm sure a lot of people are wondering that.
Yeah, you're lucky you're only 45. You're better off than us. So I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that the access to skills training and education and some of the best training in the world is open to all of us now. So, the ability to go and study through Harvard or whatever it happens to be online is there. So I would strongly encourage people to be looking at what are the skills that I don't have that are going to be required going forward over the next 20 years, particularly around digital. I can tell you the one area that is so in demand at the moment is digital, and it's not just local, it's global. So skill yourself up on that as much as you can. It's not too late, I promise you. 20 years is still a long period in terms of a career. So yeah, I would get online, do the courses, build up the skill, find opportunities within your current organization to apply those skills.
Right. Thank you, Jody. In conclusion, I would like to thank Guy Lundy for his brilliant presentation. Thanks to all of you who joined PERCO SA Ponder presentation. And should you like to speak to Guy, please contact our office to help you facilitate it. Thank you to Jody Lee and Davy for assisting in hosting the event. Guy has offered to stay on for an additional 15 minutes till 10 o'clock, so you are welcome to stay behind and continue with the question and answer session. I'll now hand over to Jody Lee to continue facilitating the Q&A session. Thank you to you all and goodbye.
Thank you so much. Let's just carry on with some questions then. It says here, you talked about the inequality increasing, example of CEO pay versus the rest of the employee base, I presume she means. This is or has been driven by a capitalist economy. For sustainability, do you see this changing and the inequality gap being reviewed as activism in the way people select the companies they work for? Sure, that's a mouthful.
So, yeah, I think that what has happened is that that sort of growth in inequality that has been a longer term trend has certainly been something that has sort of been self-fulfilling. So, as people have become more powerful, they've gained more power. And as that middle has started to become less and less of a factor, you've seen the middle class sort of fall back. So there is for example, there's a book recently written by Anne Case and Angus Deaton called Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. And they look at the way in which that's happened in America since the 1950s, and particularly post the 1970s, where the reduction in workers' ability to stand up for themselves and to earn what they were earning before has reduced. So it's a long-term trend that has happened. In terms of going forward, I think it's been given a particular knock now because of what's happened with COVID, and that's a real challenge in that it makes it worse, but at the same time it also highlights the problem even more than it was being highlighted before. So I think what you will see is a more determined focus from governments across the world to be more to find ways in which to ensure that the economy is more equally distributed. The countries that I would say are probably good at this tend to be the Scandinavian countries. Northern European countries tend to be very equally spread in terms of the difference between the highest and the lowest earners, and also having a social net, safety net that enables people who are falling out of traditional jobs to be retrained, to be put back into the workplace, and have other ways in which to ensure that they don't end up on the street. So I think that countries around the world are going to be increasingly looking at how do we try to emulate that as much as possible, because if we don't, the potential for social unrest, as we've seen over the last year all over the world, not just here in South Africa. Remember that in the United States last year, there was rioting and looting happening as well. So all over the world, the social unrest as a result of this inequality has increased, and it's increased the focus and the realization that something needs to be done to change it.
Thanks, Guy. So I see, obviously there's some anxiety around certain industries, marketing, entertainment industry, that sort of thing. There's a question here asking about the growth around those industries, and also around the property development sort of space. Have you got any insights to offer around that?
So yeah, it's been interesting to observe how some industries have been hit particularly hard, and how others have benefited. So, for example, our business, which consults on leadership, on change, on culture, on placing people, we've benefited from change, which is quite interesting because we really expected that we would be hit very hard because everything would just stop. But actually, businesses have been using companies like ourselves to help them become more resilient, and also to bring in people to the business that can do things differently to the way that they were. On the other hand, businesses like tourism, conferencing, etc., have really suffered. Restaurants. I read the other day that 1,100 restaurants have closed in South Africa over the last year. And what's the challenge that we're going to face going forward is that many of the people that were in that industry are going to move out of the industry, and they're going to look for something else entirely. To bring them back into the industry when they are needed is going to be challenging. And you can see this happening in the UK at the moment. They've now opened up post all of vaccination that's happened, and they've got 1 million vacancies. It's the highest number of vacancies they've had in many decades. Because people have left many of the industries, like the restaurants and the sandwich shops and things like that, and they're not intending to come back. They're now doing something else. So that's a challenge that people in those industries are going to face. But it's also an opportunity because it means less competition. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but
yeah. I think that's very interesting because it kind of leaves a gap in the job market, even though there's a shortage of jobs. It's a weird scenario, isn't it? I see there's a question here, interestingly, from someone in the hospitality space. Melody is asking how human resource management is likely to be affected in the future since the shift to working from home.
So human resource management is already changing. It's quite interesting how we've observed it, how it's changing from being relatively administrative in many cases. It's often within companies been seen as quite an administrative function. You record the salaries, you record the hours, etc., as opposed to leading strategically, and that is changing quite fundamentally. So there's a growing realization that it's a lot harder to manage your staff when they're not all sitting in the same place. And that just takes a whole different mindset. So leaders, CEOs are turning to their HR leadership to help them with that process. For example, culture. How does working remotely affect culture? So a much greater emphasis on HR's role in promoting a particular culture, driving a particular culture, ensuring the wellness of the people within the organization, and ensuring the sustainability of the human side of the organization, rather than kind of ticking boxes and filling in forms, which many leaders have traditionally kind of seen as being HR's role.
It ties into the empathy that you were talking about earlier as well, I think.
Yes.
Fahim is asking, do you have any advice for smaller businesses in adapting towards these trends, albeit with limited resources? Also, how do you see the shift in trends in the repairs and maintenance and construction industries?
So in the smaller businesses, I think the key thing for small businesses to do is to identify what problems need to be solved. One of the things that's been shown quite clearly, I think it first sort of came about in the pharmaceutical industry, where in fact there was a court case that was centered around the fact that pharmaceutical companies don't innovate because they've become too big and they protect what they've got rather than actually spending money on research and development. And the same thing applies across the board. It's true of banks. It's true of so many different organizations construction firms that are used to doing things in a certain way, and they've got shareholders to answer to. And so they're not doing certain things. And that's where the opportunity lies for smaller businesses that are agile, that are innovative, that come up with interesting new ways to solve problems that aren't being solved by big organizations. And if you can identify in your particular sector, what are the problems that are not being solved, and then become a player that specializes in that, that's where your opportunity lies. And I think of, for example, a South African company called Yoko. Many of you will have used one of their terminals. When you go to a smaller business and you use your card, they'll have a little Yoko machine that is linked to their cell phone in that small business. Yoko identified an opportunity to provide credit card payments to small businesses because the banks were just too expensive and it was too difficult to get one of those normal terminals. Well, they've just had their third round of funding, which was $83 million. So almost R1 billion worth of funding that's just been poured into Yoko by international investors. So small business started 10 years ago, absolutely flying today because they identified a gap in the market that the big banks just weren't addressing. In terms of the construction industry, I think identifying the home as castle as a key trend is certainly an opportunity. Smaller, more messy, a lot more smaller customers to deal with, but finding ways to create the home as castle and play to that need is certainly something that I think smaller businesses in the construction industry can definitely benefit from.
Yeah, innovation and problem solving.
Yeah.
I think that kind of wraps it up. I'm not seeing any other questions here. I've got a question here, but I think it's going to involve a crystal ball. Juanita wants to know what the due date is for the end of the pandemic. Ha ha ha, she says.
I mean, I'll give my guess. And I think it's based on the last major pandemic we had 100 years ago. I would say we've got another year to 18 months of this. If you look at what's happened recently in the UK, the Economist actually had a very interesting graph which showed the increase in infections during the third wave in June, July, and then the number of deaths in June, July. And if you compare it with the two previous waves, it's incomparable because they have about 65% of their population vaccinated now. People are still getting sick, but they're not dying. And as a result, the more that we get people vaccinated and the more people who have been sick and have a level of immunity, as it increases, the number of people dying will decrease and we will move into a space where having COVID is like having flu. We're not there yet, but I'd say in a year to 18 months, we'll get there.
Gosh, okay, well, that said, that's a little bit depressing, that little timeline. But what we have got to be a bit of a pick-me-up is the Take-A-Lot voucher that we're going to give away at the end of every ponder. It's 1,000 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher, and the winner this week is Ilse van Aswegen. She's a travel coordinator at the University of Pretoria. So that's our winner this week for the Take-A-Lot voucher of 1,000 Rand. So that'll cheer you up for the next 18 months. But thank you so much, Guy. I think that's a wrap. Really appreciate you staying on till 10 a.m. And thank you to everybody for attending. Really nice turnout again for the Ponder session. So we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. And that's a wrap.
Thank you very much.
Bye.